In this part of the course, we're going to be looking at therapeutic environments and the idea of architecture as related to hospice and palliative care. But before I get into that specifically, I want to look at it more broadly in terms of the healthcare sector and the idea of design. And I think this is something that we don't think much about as Canadians. Many of us we grow up from a very early age in they're public environments that have been designed, but we don't think about it. So if you think back to your early classrooms, some of them have been built in the 70s when I don't know what was going on there, but they wanted to create it in pods and circles, and so it can become a bit faddish as well. But I want to look at some larger principles around the ways in which the actual environment can facilitate healing, and also how that impacts on the people working there and visiting there. It's all the same. So the patient and their family and community, and then the people working there. So I'm going to look at a number of different examples and principles, and also some examples from history that have had religious influences on them or have emerged out of religion. And so I just wanted to begin by quoting Gessler, who writes in his chapter, Therapeutic Hospital Environments, "For many, if not most people, a hospital does not conjure up images of a healing place." So that's not surprising, but that is strange. If we look at it, isn't a hospital supposed to be a place of healing? Yes, it is. So why aren't we creating environments in which that is facilitated? And so he says, people expect treatment for physical or mental illnesses in hospitals, but rarely anticipate spiritual, emotional, or social healing. In many times and places, hospitals have been looked upon as a last resort or a place where one goes to die, but they are important and they're at the core of our healthcare system. Can they possibly heal in a holistic way? So as I spoke about, this is a much larger topic, and you could do a whole course on this topic if we were in the medical sciences, and the medical arts. So if we look at this, I just thinking of one example, and so there's a very famous work by Goffman called The Asylum, and the way that mental health used to be looked at. And so the environments reflect the overall cultural attitudes of the time. And so we see that many of them have a kind of literally a penitential feeling to them, almost as though it's a punishment. And so a lot of buildings, well, that was obviously not necessarily done consciously, but I just think back to when I first moved to North Bay, the old mental hospital was still being used, and I got on the wrong bus one time, and I ended up going up this long winding hill and down, and we stopped outside of it, and it was truly frightening. It was like something out of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It had barbed wire, rolls of barbed wire on the top of the fences, this very bleak looking building. And I thought to myself at the time, how could that possibly help anybody that's struggling in any way, physically or mentally? That kind of environment, to me, would just add to the stress and to the strain the person's feeling. So I think this is a very important conversation, and it's been interesting to see the way in which hospice and palliative care in some ways has been leading the charge, because they're not as tied to the technical aspects of medicine. They've had a little bit more leeway, and in their philosophy they've had more leeway. But again, that creeping medicalization also can influence this. So these larger principles are something I want to look at. So this is a reception or waiting room at a hospital. I've just picked an image at random, and this looks very similar to all the hospital reception rooms that I've been in my life. And I use versions of this in my health and healing class, and I think some of you are in that class, so there's going to be a little bit of overlap in this section. And so really, if you were just showing this image to somebody, you might think this is the driver's license bureau, or it could be any bureaucratic space in the Western world. And so it has all the hallmarks of that, the absolutely terrible fluorescent lighting, lack of natural light, the impersonality of it. And certainly in the one in the North Bay Hospital, there's a piece of glass between the person who receives you and you. And so I'm just going to say it's a completely alienating environment. And this is at a time when people are often, particularly if it's an emergency room, a state of duress or stress. And so I've heard numerous stories about how offhandedly people often get treated, and no doubt that's because the intake person is feeling overwhelmed by the number of people. So I'm not trying to lay blame here. I'm trying to look at what are some other options that we have before us. Another problem, and I have a student that's from India, and apparently the hospital in her hometown is different. The severe cases are dealt with differently. So you don't have people going by on gurneys and things like that. So this is often a very stressful environment. There's nothing natural about it. And so it's often been said that in this model, it's like walking into a foreign country where you don't know the language, you don't understand the layout of the land. And so I think this is something that needs to be addressed. And I think because we grow up in this, we think, oh, that's just how it has to be. Well, it doesn't. It's a designed environment. There are very basic, simple things that could be done to make this more welcoming. So I'm going to give an example from another field of healthcare, and just you can think about it, why this is different and what influence it might have on a person. I recently used this image in my health and healing course, so some of you will be familiar. So this is the reception room at the Shaolin Health Center in Toronto, and it's a traditional Chinese medical clinic, although it has other practitioners within the building. It's varied over time. Sometimes there's biomedical doctors and massage therapists and so on. So I wanted to look at this. This is so distinctly different, and I use this image because I've actually been in this space, and so I can speak to how it impacts differently versus that typical medical waiting room. And so we can see immediately, first of all, it's in a large house, and so it's in an old Victorian house that's been completely renovated. And so when you walk towards it, there's lots of trees. It's a brick house. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's in a beautiful neighborhood. And so already you feel more calm, just even walking into the space. And then you walk through the hallway. I'll show you that in the next slide. But so you can see it's got the basic bones of the original house, so the fireplace. And I think fireplaces are just so innately reassuring, regardless of whether you can use them or not. And I've watched enough of those home shows to know people love it, to have that. So if you can use it, that's even better. So these are the kind of touches that really makes them feel at home. And so it's not a home-like environment exactly. It's much more spare than that. But you can see it's got a rug, it's got natural wood everywhere, it's got natural light. And you can't really see, but in the far corner, that's actually a statue of Kuan Yin, the Buddhist goddess of compassion, the Bodhisattva of compassion. So that's setting the tone right away. And so this type of healthcare comes out of Buddhism and Taoism and other Asian practices. And so you can see how it's all fitting in here, but it's also very Canadian. The setting is very Canadian with the beautiful nature outside. And so you can also see she's got artwork there. So the overall feeling, so you can't see, but the reception is to the left. It's completely welcoming. There's usually a woman there to greet you, and then the herbs and medicines are all in these beautiful shelving units that are also made of wood, and then there's a little library of books. And so it's a very, very different experience to walk into this environment. And as I said in the other class, when I lived in Toronto, I actually used to look forward to going here because the environment was so calming and beautiful. And so I have to say, I don't think there are many places in the public health system where you're going to hear anybody say that. So I think this is such a triumph on the part of the design of this space. The other thing I wanted to mention, as somebody in my class brought up, about the people sitting in the room. And so in my experience, when you're in a typical waiting room in the public health system, the last thing you want to do is talk to anybody. You're just staring straight ahead. It's partly because the atmosphere is so strange and stressful that you're just in your own bubble. But what I've found in my own experience, and I'm not a big public chatter at all, but I would end up chatting to people because there are magazines and books and you're sitting there and it's a very home-like environment. And so you would end up actually chatting to other people. So you can see the way the space is designed is impacting on how people are interacting within that space. This is the entry hallway. So when you come in through the door, which is on the left on this photograph, you take off your shoes. So it's kind of a ritual of taking off your shoes, and then you walk into the open hallway. And so as you can see, again, natural materials. So there's a crystal there, there's an orchid, there's all the wood, there's all the natural light streaming in. And so she's definitely modernized it. Obviously, that would have been a wooden staircase in the past. So she's modernized it. It's very spare, so it's easy to clean because obviously sanitation is a huge issue when you're talking about healthcare. So I think this is, again, it's not that this is, you know, completely like a home-like environment. You can definitely tell this is a public space. But again, that idea of, so the stairway up into other treatment rooms, and then when you turn right, you're into the reception room. So again, the feeling going in is of this very open, light, welcoming, beautiful space. It actually, to me, looks a bit like a beautiful museum. So for me, at least, the feeling was very relaxed when you walk into it. When we're looking at examining these principles of design, decor, and architecture in healthcare, we're looking at, again, as we have been looking at with hospice and palliative care, a paradigm shift, a shift in thinking, and a very different worldview. And of course, for me, coming out of religious studies, I'm bringing in the elements also of religion and spirituality. And so I wanted to give an example from the past that Gessler also looks at. So he looks at the Asclepions of ancient Greece. He looks at Lourdes in France, the Catholic shrine, and he looks at Bath, the healing baths in England. And he talks about them as healing spaces. So I'm going to look at the Asclepion. There's many examples I could have used, but I think this gets at a lot of the different points that I'm going to be raising. And so the Asclepion was coming out of that larger ancient Greek tradition that was a holistic view of health that took into account the physical symptoms and manifestations of illness, but also the emotional life, the spiritual life, the environment. And so this is one of there's been excavated Asclepions all over the ancient Greek world, and so this is one of the larger ones. And so what we see with the Asclepion is that it was set apart and it was in a place of natural beauty. And so this was very much coming out of the Greek belief that nature was healing in and of itself. So being in a beautiful natural setting was therapeutic. We also see in the Asclepion there would be temples to gods and goddesses. And so I will be talking about that in the next section about having sacred room set aside for religion and meditation and reflective practices in hospices and palliative care. But the Asclepion, because it's coming out of the larger ancient Greek religious tradition and worldview, the whole place was a kind of pilgrimage site. It was a sacred site. The other thing that I always think is sort of fascinating, if you see on the left, it's actually an amphitheater. It's a theater, and so there would be plays put on. And so this seems, I think, at first look very strange, that why would they be putting on plays? But from a Greek perspective, the arts were therapeutic. And so the idea the theories of Aristotle of tragedy and comedy, that these things are actually therapeutic. They help us with catharsis and working through our emotions. And so I think that's very interesting as an idea of that could perhaps have an influence on healthcare, the recognition of the whole person and how we can work through the emotional side of being ill, for instance. And I have noticed in more and more hospitals, they have spaces for talks, so they can invite people to give talks on a variety of topics. It's not just all about illness all the time. And so with the Asclepion, as I said, we really see that holistic holding environment. So the idea of using all of these elements, the symbolic elements of the tradition, the practices, the rituals that are involved in the tradition, and then putting it within a beautiful natural setting. Building on that insight coming from ancient Greece, and it's part of many, many cultures, that idea of the role of nature in therapeutic environments, this is gaining a lot of traction. And there was a book that some of you may be aware of called The Nature Deficit, which is recognizing that many, many children now are raised in urban or suburban settings where they have very little exposure to nature. And so we're seeing that this may be part of the larger problem with these skyrocketing rates of anxiety that we're seeing in young people. It's not the only thing, obviously, but certainly if you're in a very stressful environment, that's not going to be helpful. And so there's a recognition growing out of a number of different disciplines that the ancients were right about this, that nature is in and of itself healing. And I don't think I have to make a big argument around this. All of us know that if you're feeling stressed or upset, the easiest thing to do is to go for a walk in nature or along the water or in a forested, even a small forested area. So it's very clear there's something in the human nervous system that responds immediately, and there's been numerous studies done on the influence of if a patient is looking out at a brick wall or looking out at a natural setting. And we all know this if you've been in hotels where you're looking out onto this ugly parking lot versus some beautiful scenery. It has a completely different impact on your mood and your feeling about the space. And so in the article I'm going to be attaching to this section, the writers are talking about what they call the ethical dimensions of healthcare architecture. So this idea that when I would say this is true of all architecture, but certainly when we're looking at it in this situation, it's even more important perhaps. So we're seeing the rise of what's been called biophilic design. So the use not just of nature but of natural elements, so rock, stone, etc., natural light, and how these impact. And so I'm just using an image here. You can see the difference that this would make, and there's been a number of different healthcare settings, both hospices and hospitals, who have used this. And the North Bay Mental Health Center does this to some extent. It's planted trees and they've created these kind of inner courtyards that are very lush and like mini forests. And so you would think on paper, oh, well, what good would that do? It's such a tiny space. But you can see from this image how even a small amount of a wooded area gives that feeling. So if the person is walking or being wheeled through an area like this, it's going to have a direct impact on how they're feeling. So we're seeing this slowly coming into the sector, and the idea of the role of nature both in the outdoor spaces and in the indoor spaces. This is an example of how elements of nature can be brought within an institutional setting like a hospital. And I remember as a child, when I look back, thinking, are they trying to make this look like a spaceship? And I have to say, I think I was right. I think in the 60s and 70s, there was this idea that people would be reassured by it looking so sterile and technical. And I actually spent a lot of time in a library that was built on some of these principles. Actually, it was built on the principles of brutalism, which, yes, it's a school of architecture, and its whole idea was it was meant to alienate you. So I don't understand, but this was a thing. And so a lot of the buildings, unfortunately, built in the 60s are incredibly ugly, apparently on purpose. Very strange. But anyway, we can do better than that. And so you can see this still has the elements of a hospital. It's still got a lot of that kind of glass reception area. I'm not fond of that, but one very simple thing to bring in is stone, because it's easy. It's not like fabric that makes it difficult to clean. And so stone is a very easy win. Of course, it's a bit expensive, but again, to me, you have to sort of say in the long term it's worth it. And so you can see even this simple setup here with the stone and the plants gives a very different feeling. It's still fairly stark, but you've got the natural light, the plants. And so I'm just asking you to think about it. If you walked into this setting versus that earlier one I showed you, what do you think it would make a difference in how you're feeling? You know, we've talked about this idea that when we're looking at healthcare settings, people are often under a lot of stress. So really it becomes the issue of how do we create environments that are conducive to a kind of a serene environment. And so Gessler talks about custodial bureaucratic structures. So that's not what we're going for. So this idea, of course, the practicality has to come into it. But so they're in some of the literature, they talk about if you're in a mental health unit, of that idea of privacy versus safety of the person. And so these are ethical, legal issues that have to be worked out through architecture. And so, of course, it's challenging. But I absolutely see no reason why it has to be ugly and horrible and alienating. There's no reason for that. And so I think, as I said at the beginning, it really is causing for consciousness and reflection in design. And we are starting to see that. It's always remarkable to me to hear when they're talking on the radio for fundraising for the hospital and things, it's always pretty much always about machinery. And I think that this tells us a lot about how we understand health and healthcare in our system and in our culture. And so this idea that if we have more sophisticated machinery, you know, that's the way to go. And obviously that's an important part of it, but we spend much less time talking about the environment around the people that are in that setting. And just really basic things like even the food they're eating is often not conducive to health and healing at all. And so we're going to see in the case of hospices, they often handle it very differently, the food. So I'll get to that in due course. Now, this room's still looking very much like a hospital room. I'm sure part of this is just related to practicalities of the healthcare people being able to move the bed around and so on. But it certainly is moving in a different direction. And so you can see this looks very much more like the hospice rooms at St. Christopher's House, where they're looking a lot more like a home-like environment, and you've got a plant there. And you've got the beautiful views out and lots of natural light. So this is a process that we're going through of trying to figure out what are the best design and what's a good balance between what is comfortable and what is practical. So all of these things are getting worked out, but certainly, and we're going to see with hospice and palliative care, that the design is looked at with a great deal of concern. And so particularly, and this is then influencing larger healthcare, the idea of making it a space that's comfortable for the family and visitors as well, where it can be more like a home-like environment, and also for the people that work there, so that their morale is good and everything is flowing smoothly. I want to end with this image of the North Bay Parry Sound District Health Unit, which is on Oak Street in North Bay. It's right near the downtown and right by the lake. And This picture does not do it justice. I couldn't find a picture that this is more like a mock-up before it actually existed, but I've been by it. I go by it almost every day actually. And so it's much more landscaped now around the outside. There's all sorts of native grasses and trees along the other side, and then the lake on the the far side. And so I really was struck by this once it was built, the ways in which it has taken on board a lot of these principles. And so I just want to talk about it as I think it's, as far as I can see, it's successful. I'd be interested to talk to the people who work there and get their honest opinion and of the people that go there. But I will just say that it makes me want to go inside. I walk by there all the time and I'm like, I'd like to go in there. You don't usually feel that way about any bureaucratic building in Canada, and certainly not a healthcare facility. And so I think it's a triumph, actually. And so we can see the elements that they've brought to bear here. And so lots of glass, lots of natural light. And from what I can see when I look in, there's a lot of artwork. There's a lot of Indigenous artwork on the wall. And the reception area is very beautiful, use of stone and natural light. And so it looks much more welcoming. And so you can see that even in these, and this is a hub. These health units, particularly in the north, are hubs for healthcare. So they're very, very important. And so you can see that time, energy has gone into making something. It's actually quite a beautiful looking building. There's aesthetic elements even on the outside, which I appreciate. So they clearly weren't cutting corners. And I think that complete obsession with cost cutting is part of the larger problem. And it's like, this is a public building. It's going to be there for a very long time. Why not spend the money, make it a beautiful part of the larger environment it's in, make it so it fits into the larger environment and is also welcoming for the people that go there and for the people that work there.